One of the unique appeals and idiosyncrasies of the Final Fantasy anthology is how each numerical title reinvents its world, settings, and stories. A key addition, and indeed result of that, is the frequent reimagining of its system design too, and specifically how players engage with its battle, progression, and levelling mechanics. Now, being an RPG series, Final Fantasy has always sought to strike a balance between innovation and convention, player agency, and ludo-pertinent structures. Emerging, as many JRPGs did, out of the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop genre, Final Fantasy generally hinged around turn-based mechanics, accumulating experience points to progress characters in combat, and aligning party members to stringent character classes that determined their abilities in battle, and indeed, often their role in the setting and story. These factors were correlative with the character development systems in each game, and played to varying and ever-evolving degrees into player choice in building out characters, and in many cases reflecting nuanced aspects of the setting and story, with, for example, the materia system of Final Fantasy VII showing the practical applications of processed macro in that game, and the junction system of Final Fantasy VIII playing into this central thread of story of junctioning, paramagic, and so on in that game world. Turning to the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X, it was in many respects the result of periodic experimentation and a steady climb towards freedom of customization in the Final Fantasy games, which, with the exception of Final Fantasy IX, had progressively toyed with unshackling characters from their predetermined character classes. For example, where Final Fantasy IV is well known for how closely it integrated fixed character classes to its story and the structure of its adventure, with Cecil Harvey's transition from a Dark Knight class to a Paladin class being a momentous plot point. And more broadly than that, the characters we have in our party in Final Fantasy IV at any given point of the adventure impacting the types of battle we encounter, how difficult these battles are, is representative of the more conventional, rigid character class systems in the older Final Fantasy games, where story progression and indeed story structure is much more beholden to the various characters we have in our party at any given time. Yet fast forwarding now to Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, we have a brief era of character classes becoming, if not meaningless, then certainly relegated to a point where they are mere nods to character archetypes, with base stats, weaponry, and arguably limit breaks being the only limiting factors of a given character that, for example, hint that Cloudstrife might be a knight class, or Zeldincht might be a monk class, and so on, and everything else, ranging from summons to magical and command abilities, were a customizable free-for-all across these games. And this led to a short-lived phenomena of players being able to choose to bring the character rather than the class when determining their party at any given point in the game, to the extent that one could simply wholesale switch a given character's materia setup or junction setup between two characters without much detriment. Again, the only limitations being whether the recipient character had the available materia slots to receive a given character's materia setup in the case of Final Fantasy VII, and in the case of Final Fantasy VIII, a given character's relationship with a specific summon or guardian force might be slightly different there, which was a subtlety of the game that is nonetheless character specific. Arriving now to the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X, we have what many have hailed as a sweet spot, or preferable middle ground between the conventions and strictures of JRPG classes and player freedom to build out their own character as they see fit. Indeed, the sphere grid expands beyond mere character development by assuming the previously autonomous mechanics of experience points gathering too, giving complete agency to players as to whether they buff out strength stats or speed stats or MP stats, and so on any given character. The way the sphere grid strikes its balance here is by starting each character off in a generally class-specific area of the sphere grid that generally mirrors the character's role in the game, with Lulu, for example, being a self-described black mage in the story, and appropriately she starts in an area of the sphere grid which is high in magic stats and magical abilities, particularly if you use the simplified rather than the advanced sphere grid, while Riku, for example, is essentially a thief class and starts off in an area high in speed, agility, and abilities such as Mug and Quick Pockets are available to her. The customizable aspect here comes from the comprehensive interconnectedness of the sphere grid, which means that Lulu, if the player so chooses, could stray into more melee abilities occupied by Orin or Waka, and vice versa, with nothing truly being off limits. And the only real barrier that is placed on the player here is weapon classes, which remain assigned to specific characters, and significantly the role of summoning, which, for essential narrative purposes, remains the sole preserve of Lady Yuna. Finally, unlike the way earlier customizable games such as Final Fantasy VII and VIII allowed the wholesale exchange of ability setups, Final Fantasy X's sphere grid is character specific, meaning that the player is building out a permanent character class, whether traditional or customized, and if Orin, for example, is, for whatever reason, built out as a white mage, and Lulu as a warrior, then that's how their attributes are set, and if you need a white mage in battle, you need to pull in Orin to be present there. And this is the case pretty much right up until towards the end of the game, where if one grinds enough, you can maximize or significantly overlap every character's attributes on the sphere grid to create this sort of omni-strength that renders character classes and custom character classes somewhat redundant. So this pursuit of player agency within a still loosely structured system was a great setup for a Final Fantasy game, I think. And while I do understand some of the criticisms that the sphere grid receives, some players deem it laborious or micromanagement, because we're having to level up individual character stats such as strength and speed and so on, rather than simply choosing their abilities, I do nonetheless think it struck a good balance. And for example, if we look comparatively forwards to Final Fantasy XII, which offers complete freedom of character builds, including weapon classes, particularly the original version of Final Fantasy XII, not the Zodiac Age, I think the argument that exists for the characters in FF12 being forgettable or unlikable, which I don't necessarily agree with personally, and I think it stems perhaps in some part from this complete freedom of customization, because without even having a nod towards a character archetype, without having even simply weapon classes to offer some semblance of personality or relevance to ability, and even limit breaks, if we look at them in FF12 being somewhat untethered from cool weapon-specific abilities like jump or cross-slash or whatever, I suppose yes, we could see a certain blandness there compared to, for example, Orin, who is ostensibly in form, function and design a warrior samurai, or Vivi, who is likewise a black mage, and so on. And I think personally the only criticism I have of the sphere grid, though it is quite a pedantic one, is that where the materia system, the junction system, and even the license system in FF12 have this sort of tangible relationship to and existence in the actual setting of their respective games, the sphere grid, aside from running on this symbolic theme of spheres and spheres existing in FF10, has only a tenuous link to the setting of Final Fantasy X. And actually Yoshinori Kitase has previously stated that the original idea for the sphere grid system was pretty much the same as it is laid out, but it was supposed to be based on tattoos, and it was a tattoo-based system rather than a sphere-based system. And the reason that the designs of Seymour and Jecht and other characters like this have distinctive tattoos is that these were supposed to represent certain character abilities, certain attributes, which would have found their way into the leveling system if the original vision was maintained. Which incidentally is doubly interesting if you've played Far Cry 3, because this is literally how the skill tree is unlocked and represented in the game. So, all said, the sphere grid is a fascinating experiment to be found only in Final Fantasy X that ambitiously sought to elevate the way JRPGs are experienced with respect to player input, while retaining the conventions that add to that genre specificity and indeed personality of a given character in a given game world. And while, as I say, it's not universally loved by all, it remains a personal favourite of mine in the Final Fantasy anthology. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.